Hello and welcome back. Happy New Year and all that. Today we are going to make an explosion. So there's quite a few steps to this. So this will be a fairly long tutorial, I think. So first of all, I'm going to change to Cycles Render. Blender has built into it a Quick Effects, Quick Smoke, and has Quick Explode as well. And we can let's Quick Explode, which is not great. We'll delete that. We'll add our cube back in, and we'll go Object, Quick Effects, Quick Smoke, and press play, and there's a smoke effect without us having to do very much at all. But we're not going to do that either, so we're going to build one from scratch. Okay, so we're in front orthographic mode, and we are going to kind of talk our way through an explosion. So the first thing we need to do is, before we make there's obvious decisions to be made about, like, what is the explosion, how big is the explosion, is there a background image or piece of video that it has to fit into in terms of scale, and all of those things. So what I'm going to make in this tutorial is just something fairly generic, but before you would set out to make one, you would have to think about how you're going to use it. So let's just have a look at these tools that we need, or these the components. So the first thing I'm going to do is add in a cube, and I'm going to rename it Domain. So in this simulation here, so I'm going to go S5 and then G, and just move this up. So when we're making an explosion, or making smoke or fire, or one of these simulations in Blender, there has to be sort of a box or an area that the effect takes place within. If you had multiple fires or multiple explosions, then you would have multiple domains. Now you could just use one huge domain, but it would take forever to render. So this box here is not going to be seen in the finished render. This is just the area in which our explosion will happen. So let's just define that. So I'm going to make this a little bit wider and go over here to my Physics tab, and then I'm going to select Smoke, because that's what we're going to try and create, and this is going to be our domain. So there it is, there, it's our domain. Now we'll have a look at all these settings in a little while. So the next thing I'm going to do is something completely unconnected to smoke. I'm going to add in some debris. So I'm going to go and add in an icosphere. I'm going to call it Stone. I am going to go into edit mode, turn on proportional editing, and just kind of pull and push and squish this into some sort of stone-like shape, so that it doesn't look like a sphere anymore. Okay, so that'll do. So that's going to be Stone 1. Now, oops, I'm going to select it all, and I'm going to unwrap it, and we will have a look here at our UV image editor. So it hasn't unwrapped terribly well, so we'll unwrap it again and use Smart Unwrap, and then I'm going to click Open and load in a fairly generic sort of concrete texture. And again, the texture you would use would be specific to the environment that your explosion was taking place in. I'm going to go to Materials. I'm going to use the default material, but I'm going to rename it Stone, and I'm going to say Use Nodes. And then in my node editor, we're going to right click on my diffuse shader and delete it, add in our principal shader. Oh, that didn't work. I am using a new trackball that Santi brought me. So see if we can get it to work. So I'm going to take specularity away because we don't want our concrete to be shiny, and I'm going to add in our image texture. No, I'm not. Texture, image texture, there we go, and connect these two, and then load in that concrete image. Okay, so that's a fairly basic texture. I'll make that a bit smaller for now. So in object mode, I am going to create a first of all, scale this down. So I'm going to create 2 more of these, so Shift D for duplicate, duplicate again, and then we will hang on, and turn back on proportional editing. See if we can create 3 distinct looking stones. So we'll call this stone 2 and stone 3. Okay, now I'm going to take the 3 of these, okay, not that guy, and I'm going to go Control G and make them a group, and then just move them down on Z. It's going to hide them underneath the cube here. So I've made them a group, and if I go over here, it's part of where's their group information? Let's select one of them. Yeah, it's in a group called group. So let's rename that group. We'll call it stones. And then if I select any one of these, it's in a group called stones. Okay. Now I'm going to add in a ground plane, which is this plane. We'll scale it up, and we'll call it ground. Now, nearly there. So let's start with our debris. So I'm going to add an icosphere. I'm going to delete the bottom half of it. Oops, X and vertices. Oh dear. Now, the reason I'm using an icosphere here is if I used a UV sphere, it would have a concentration of triangles at the top, whereas this is an even sort of spread of faces. So I'm just going to make that a bit smaller. And I'm going to add a particle system to this where my debris is going to fly up in the air. So I'm going to make a new particle system. No, I'm not bored of my background. We're going to call this stones, and up here we'll rename it stones as well. Now we don't need 1,000 particles, we'll put in say 60. And now we don't want this to be 200 frames long, which is 8 seconds. We want this to come out in a burst, so we'll make it about actually we'll make it about 8 frames because it's going to be an explosion. And with that in mind, we'll go down here and we're going to change this to 50. So the entire explosion, what we're going to look at anyway, is only going to be about 2 seconds. Now, we've got an emitter. We've got the number of particles at 60. And we start at frame 1 and end at frame 8. So let's press play. There we go. So it's not terribly impressive. So let's make it even shorter. I'll make it say 6. And what we need to do is, first of all, we'll have a look at how this works. When I press play, any changes that I make, so if I make a change now, it won't take effect until the animation, or it goes back to frame 0 and starts playing again. So I want to give this velocity on the z-axis. So I want them to go up. Okay, and we can let that play on, and we can increase the velocity that goes up. And then I'm going to increase the velocity they have out of each face, so it'll go in the direction of each face, so it'll in effect make the explosion be wider. Okay, and then I want randomness added into that. Yeah, maybe not that much randomness. Okay. So, now I'm going to replace the objects. At the moment that they'll render with a halo, which would be like a glow. I'm going to replace them with our group. So these are all our stones that are now being thrown out, and they're very small, so we can increase them in size, and we can change the randomness of the size of the pieces. So this is not too bad. However, it's all quite uniform and there's no rotation. So let's turn on rotation and make it dynamic, so that they will, turn in different directions. And let's increase the angular velocity of the rotation, so that they're spinning quite wildly. That might be a bit too much. And we'll increase the randomness of that a little bit. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So this is my particles, or my debris that's going to fly out of my my explosion. Okay, so before I go any further, just for James, I'm going to save this. So File, Save. I'm going to put it onto my desktop, and I'm going to create a folder. Now I normally don't create a folder, but I'm going to call this Explode, and I'll do the same with this. Now, the way we're going to work with this, we're going to have to do a thing called baking when we create our fire and our smoke. And if you haven't saved the file, if you've given it a destination, first of all, it won't bake. But secondly, it'll have additional information that doesn't reside inside the blend file. So it needs to be in a folder, so it'll save that cached data wherever you place your blend file. So if it's not in its own folder, you may end up, if you put it on your C drive or on your desktop, you could end up with a lot of additional data in that location that you didn't necessarily want, that will clutter up your desktop or something. Anyway, so I've saved my blend file into a folder called Explode. Now let's go make some smoke and fire. So I'm going to add another icosphere, and as before, I'm going to delete the bottom half of it because I don't want my explosion to come off the faces that are pointing downwards. Now this is going to be our main sort of mushroom cloud. So I'm going to call this main smoke. And I got a cap lock on there, so we'll do that again. So main smoke. And what I'm going to do with this is, at frame 1, I'm going to insert a keyframe on scale. And then I am going to go to frame, say 15, and scale it up to about there, and then add another keyframe in, so it's getting bigger. Okay, so now let's make this work. So we've already, with this big box here in the physics panel, we made that a domain. So with this selected, this is our icosphere that so this is the icosphere to we'll call this stone emitter. Now labeling helps. So main smoke is the one I'm interested in. So I'm going to go turn on smoke here. And what we did before was we made it a domain. This isn't a domain, this is going to be a flow. This is going to actually, emit smoke. And I'm going to turn on this thing here, initial velocity, and it'll give us a burst of velocity at the beginning. And then there's a whole bunch of settings that we can play with here. The surface and the volume will determine, I suppose, the transparency of the smoke, how dense it is. And the density of this setting here also controls how thick it is. These will give us a more dramatic effect. Here, we'll just do it and you'll see how it works. So I'm going to press play. So there's my mushroom cloud, and I'll just pause it there. So if I reduce this surface setting to 0.5 and then I reset my simulation and press play, you'll see that I can actually see through that smoke to the surface of the icosphere. Whereas if I increase this here, I can't see through it anymore. So I have changed, in effect, the density of it. This acts somewhat like a contrast control, as far as I can see with it. And then this density here is, if I reduce it to 0, we have no smoke. So this is almost like a transparency setting as well. Okay. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in what's called Smoke Advanced. And if we look at this from the top, it's completely symmetrical, which is not how smoke behaves, and it's not how our particles are behaving. So I'm going to say use texture, and this is going to allow us to, change this symmetrical pattern. So what texture will we use? Well, we'll use this one here, Tex, which is a built-in texture. And these are called procedural textures that we're going to look at. These are kind of built into Blender. They don't use images, they use algorithms, use maths. So I'm going to use Voronoi, and I am going to set, actually I'm not terribly interested in the intensity of it, it's the scale of it I'm interested in. And about that, yeah, that'll be fine there. Okay, so let's go back here, and so what we should see with any look is basically more interference, so that it's not one continuous homogeneous explosion, which we're starting to see in it. Okay, now let's go back here to our domain. Now our animation is stopping at frame 50. Let's bring that up to say 500, and you'll see that the smoke will keep going until it hits the top, which is obviously not what we want. So I'm going to turn this on here, dissolve, and I'm going to stop this because it's only a frame 300, and I'm going to go back to frame 50. Oh, hang on, I put frame 50 in there, I'm going to put it in there, 50. Now, so then we might make it a bit longer, let's put it in at 100. Okay, so our smoke does not rise forever. Okay, so that's not too bad. Now, what we want is the smoke to rise a little bit faster, and we can do this here in the domain. So okay, and now this here, vorticity, is interesting. This is again about kind of turbulence and how twirly it is. Twirly is probably not the best adjective in the world, but Okay, and I'm going to turn this on here, smoke adaptive domain. So what you're going to see is a new box enter the equation, and it'll speed up the rendering a bit. So it's basically putting a domain inside our domain and only rendering where it needs to. Okay, so that's our first piece of smoke that we've added in. Now the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my stone emitter, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add smoke to it as a flow, but I do not want to add smoke to its mesh. I want to add it to its particle system, and I need to then name the particle system, and then you can start to see the smoke follow the particles as they come out. Okay, and we will increase that sampling there. It's just to do a quality. We'll come back, we'll have a whole bunch of quality settings to work on. I'm going to turn on initial velocity for this as well, so we get a kind of a burst at the beginning. Okay, so far so good. I'm just going to press stop here. I'm going to add in now, we have no fire, so I'm going to add in another icosphere. I go into edit mode. As before, I'm going to delete these bottom vertices. I'm going to scale it down, and what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to start this very small, and I'm going to go insert keyframe on scaling, and I'm going to move forward just 2 frames, and I'm going to scale this up and insert keyframe, and then go forward 2 more frames and scale it back down again. So this is gonna be flame, but in effect it'll be like a flash of light, like it's big and small really quickly, as you would expect in an explosion. So over here now I have that selected. I don't need a separate domain for this, in the same way that I added extra smoke to the particles that are coming out, the debris. I don't need to add another domain. I can just have one domain for everything. So I'm going to click on smoke and flow, and this time I'm going to pick fire and smoke. Turn on initial velocity. Use texture, and use the same texture as before, and we'll increase the size. So with those 1, 2 sort of extra bits, we're just going to look at the default settings. Okay, so it's not too bad. It's let's have a play with some of these settings here. So it's density. We can't make it any denser, but I can make it more opaque here. Now you can see it's become a big sort of pancake of fire, which is not what we want. So we'll bring this back down. Okay, so we'll lower it a bit more. Okay, then we'll increase the volume effect. Okay, so that's not too bad at all. So let's just pause that. So what we have is a fairly basic simulation of an explosion. Now with a couple of things to do, I'm just going to, because I'm going to render this in a moment, I'm going to unwrap the ground, and and I'm going to add the concrete texture to it. Just double check that it's unwrapped correctly. And it has. And then I'm just going to look through my camera. So that's what my camera, where's my camera, sees. I'm going to go lock camera to view and zoom out a little bit. And yeah, we'll leave that there. Now, before I go any further, I need to do a thing called baking. Now, hidden away here, it says smoke cache. Is this very important section or panel here. So, first thing is our simulation is only 100 frames long, but it's set up to bake for 250, so we need to change that to match our simulation, otherwise we'll be baking frames that we don't need. It'll bake to the same directory that we've saved in, so it's important that we do that. I'm going to save now, and I'm going to turn on Smoke High Resolution. Now when I do that, it will increase the quality of the smoke that we emit hugely, but it'll also increase the render time hugely. So I'm going to do 3 subdivisions, and up here I'm going to go put in a resolution of 100. Now when this comes out the other end, you may or may not you may think the quality is fine, or in which case I may be able to reduce it, or you may think actually if I were doing this for something photorealistic I need to increase them even to a higher level. So I'm going to click on bake, and when I do that, then I'm going to pause the recording because this could take quite a while. So this has baked, and we'll just play it here. So that's our explosion. Now I had to stop the bake and start it again, so I have changed the high resolution divisions to 1 from 3, and these divisions from 100 to 50. I'm sure I could have kept these at 100, but with these set to 3 it was going to take over an hour, so yeah, I stopped that, and then I lowered the resolution, and it baked in about 30-40 seconds. Okay, so that information is now stored. So when we press play now, we no longer have the luxury of changing these settings. So baking is the last part of our journey. We can't change the settings now to make this faster or slower or more transparent or more voluminous, etc. But what we do have to do is we have to set this up as a set up the nodes to get the color from our simulation. So we're going to go to our materials window, and we're going to create a new material, and we're going to call this smoke fire. Now this is an unusual sort of setup, so we're going to delete this as we normally would. Then we're going to add a volume scattering and a volume absorption, these two nodes, and these two basically in combination make our smoke. Now I need to add an add shader, because we need both of these. So I'm going to link these in here. And then we're going to output not to surface but to volume. So this will get us our smoke. So if we rendered it now, we would get a version of smoke. But we have very little control over our smoke. So what we'll do here is we're going to add an input called attribute. And we're going to type in a word here, density. And this is sort of a slightly unusual way for Blender to work, but this is how this works. We're going to add in a maths node, a multiplier. So I'm going to change this to multiply. And we're going to take this here and put it into value. And then we're going to take the multiply value and put that into our density. We can also put it into the density here. Now that's pretty much our smoke setup, and we can increase here. We'll have a look at this in a minute. When we change this value, we can change literally. We have control over the density of the smoke. But what we don't have here is anything set up for the fire, for the flames. So to do that, we're going to add in another input attribute, and this one is going to be called flame. And this is case sensitive, so if you put in a capital F, for example, it wouldn't work. And that is going to go into an emitter. Okay, and we'll connect color to color. And then we need an add shader. We add that in there. Now the only problem we have with this is we haven't any control over, effectively, over the color of our fire. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add in we'll find it now, a color ramp. There we go. I'm going to add that in there. Now, I should have changed this to rendered mode. So this is our smoke. This is our density. So I can reduce the density. Whoops, no, that's a minus number. So you can see the smoke's almost gone away, and I can increase that, and now my smoke is very dense. Now in the middle here is our flame. So I'll change that to say 2. Maybe 2 is not enough, maybe 4. Anyway, what we're looking at now is the color of the flame. At the moment it's white, and this color ramp here will allow us to change the color of the flame. So I hit plus, I'm adding a color here, and while I do this, I'm actually going to change this to material mode, just because it'll be faster. Now when you look at a flame, the color that you get is quite interesting, and is worth actually a little study if you're going to do explosions. So it will go from a kind of a beigey color to a bright orange to then a red color, and we'll leave it to end in black. And when it's at its hottest, if we change its alpha value to say 0.3, and then when it's beige, we'll change its alpha value to say 0.6, and then this one to say 0.9. Nope, didn't get that in. 0.9, 0.9. There we go. Now, let's go back to rendered. So what we're actually ramping up here is the color value of our flame. So there's too much red in there. So we'll bring that way. So we're just getting red at the very end of the flame, the very tip. And we'll extend that one that way. And again, you can spend a long time sort of tweaking these. And we can also make this much brighter. And you can see all of the inherent fireflies that immediately appear. Or we can bring it back to its defaults or slightly lower, so say 0.8. But we probably want it to be, we'll leave it at its default 1 for now. Maybe might punch it up a bit. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and I am going to hit F12 for a render. Before I do that, I'm just going to have a quick look. So I'm on CPU rendering. I don't want that, so we'll go to GPU, and I'll go to Full HD, if it'll allow me. Maybe yes, no. I think what's happening here is it's still sampling in my viewport. So let's get into sampling, which is our quality setting, and let's change the viewport shading to 5. So then all it ever has to do here is 5. And we'll change the render settings just to 50 for now. And again, we may have to increase this if we want to increase the quality of our rendered image. Now, at the moment it's at 24, so we want to change it to 25 frames a second. And we're exporting a PNG sequence, so we'll do AVI RAW. And we will export this to our desktop and explode, which is what we set up for this. And you can see here I've got a cache where it's put all the baked information. So we'll call this explode. So first thing was we'll just render a single frame and see what we get. Now I'm going to hit escape there very quickly, and if you remember, there was a whole series of things we did to speed up our renders before. So I'm going to go to my light paths, and I'm going to reduce these to say 5, and I'm going to reduce both of these to 3. Nope, not 33. 3. And I'm going to go to performance and change these to 256. Now I could probably push these a bit bigger, but I shan't. So I'm going to hit render. And let's see what we get. So this is frame 25 that we're rendering, so we're 1 second in. And you can see it's not the fastest in the world, so it's sampling 16 out of 50 here, so it's quite slow per frame. So if we have we're on I don't know how many tiles we have, 40 tiles, so this is probably going to take about 3 or 4 minutes to render. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to again pause the recording, and then show you the finished render. So this is our finished frame. It took 5.5 minutes to render, so it's quite a long render time. You can see it's still quite noisy, although everything will be moving very quickly, so you won't see that so much. There's a whole bunch of little things we need to do. We haven't at all talked about how to light it. Although what we'd be lighting would be the individual parts, the ground plane and the rock particles, the stones, rather than the actual smoke and fire. We've left in, we can see this kind of dome here. This is one of our emitters that we haven't told it not to render. And then the particles themselves, the rocks, we haven't made them rigid bodies so that they won't have any physics. So it would be nice as if they fell, hit the ground, and kind of bounced along the ground. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to free the bake of the smoke, so that as they bounce, the smoke will kind of move with them a bit. So I'm actually going to go away and do all that, and then the bits that I haven't shown you here, I'll show you in class. And but what I'm going to do is pause this and then show you sort of the finished product. And so you can see here, what I've got is a rather long render, so I'm going to end this tutorial and then I'll put up the finished animation as a separate piece of video. You can see here I'm on frame 54, and it's approximately 1 minute 10 seconds, so I'm under 50 minutes or so to render in this. It's going to be about a 2-hour render, which it won't be worth. I'm going to let it render out anyway. But you'll see in the finished render that the stones sort of bounce along the ground, and you've missed sort of the large kind of mushroom cloud at the beginning. So it'll look well, but we can still tweak it and make it look better. So I'm just going to end this now, and then I'll put the finished animation up separately.